On April 29, 1945, American soldiers crossed a railroad line near Munich and discovered what evil actually looks like. What followed was not a liberation, it was a breaking point. April 29, 1945. Sunday morning. Cold air, low gray sky. Elements of the 45th Infantry Division advanced toward a large complex outside Munich. Their briefing suggested a supply site or an industrial facility. No one told them the truth. They reached a railway spur outside the perimeter. On the tracks stood a stationary train, 39 cattle cars, sealed and silent. The soldiers noticed the smell first. When one of the officers opened a car, the reality became unavoidable. Inside were thousands of corpses, men, women, and children, emaciated, beaten, stacked where they had collapsed. Many had died of thirst and exposure after being abandoned during the final days of the war. Some bodies bore signs of desperation so extreme it did not seem human. The men of the division were combat veterans. They had fought in Italy and France. They had seen death repeatedly. None of that prepared them for this. A 19-year-old private from Oklahoma sat down in the snow and cried. Another soldier vomited. Shock passed quickly. What replaced it was rage, controlled at first, then barely restrained. They looked toward the SS guard towers rising over Dachau, and something fundamental shifted. At that moment, discipline collided with emotion. Rules that governed surrender and custody felt abstract against what lay on the tracks. Anger hardened into the conviction that justice had already failed here. This moment would later be known as the Dachau Liberation Reprisals, the day American soldiers crossed a moral line, the day SS guards were lined up against a wall, and the day the U.S. Army quietly decided not to look too closely. The men of the 45th were not criminals. They were farm boys, factory workers, students. Until that morning, they were known as professional soldiers, taking prisoners, treating wounded enemies, following orders. Dachau changed that in minutes. On the ground, command fell to Felix Sparks. He attempted to impose control. Orders were shouted to keep moving and not fixate on the train. It was impossible. More than 2,000 bodies lay inside those cars. The soldiers passed them at close range, seeing hollow faces and open eyes frozen in place. One private later summarized the mood simply: they were beyond anger. Inside the camp, the SS presence remained. The commandant, Martin Weiss, had already fled. In his place stood a young officer, Heinrich Wicker, and several hundred SS guards. Wicker understood the situation immediately. Germany was finished. He prepared to surrender. What happened next would echo all the way up the chain of command to George S. Patton himself, and would be quietly buried in reports for decades. He polished his boots. He stepped forward carrying a white flag. He expected to be treated as an officer. He expected formality. He expected the rules to hold. Standing before the Americans, Heinrich Wicker formally announced the surrender of the camp to the United States Army. An American officer looked at him, clean, well-fed, then past him, toward the emaciated bodies stacked behind the wire. There was no ceremony, no acknowledgement. The surrender immediately collapsed into disorder. As American troops entered the camp, the prisoners reacted first. Tens of thousands surged forward, starving, skeletal, barely able to stand. They cried out, shouted, and wept as they pressed against the fences, repeating the same word over and over: Americans. Liberation, for them, was real and immediate. For the soldiers, the focus shifted elsewhere. Near a coal yard inside the camp, a group of SS guards attempted to surrender. They raised their hands. They repeated the same phrase, Hitler kaputt, believing it might protect them. It did not. An American officer on the scene, widely identified as Jack Bushyhead, had just come from the crematorium. He had seen the ovens. Ash still filled them. He stood facing SS guards who appeared unharmed, orderly, and defiant. No formal command was given. The officer made a brief hand gesture. The guards were ordered against a brick wall. Confused, they complied. Roughly 50 men stood in line. Some began to panic. One attempted to invoke the Geneva Convention. Nearby, an American machine gun crew set up a .30 caliber weapon. The gunner looked to the officer for confirmation. The officer nodded. The burst lasted only seconds. When it ended, the guards lay motionless or dying in the snow, which was stained with coal dust and blood. Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks heard the firing and ran toward the scene. He arrived as additional shots were still being fired into the bodies. Sparks drew his pistol and fired into the air. He shouted for it to stop. When he confronted the gunner, the response was not defiance, but breakdown. The man was crying. He insisted the guards deserved what happened. The shooting did not end there. At another location inside the camp, Tower B SS guards attempted to surrender by climbing down with their hands raised. They were shot before reaching the ground. Their bodies fell into the moat. American soldiers then fired into the water to ensure none survived. Later, one soldier tried to describe the day in a letter home. He did not frame it as combat. He wrote that it no longer felt like war. It felt like something else entirely. What followed was not combat. It was execution. One soldier later admitted that after seeing the boxcars, he felt nothing at all. The guards no longer registered as human. The Americans were not the only ones taking revenge. Prisoners broke out of the barracks. They were skeletal, barely able to stand, but adrenaline carried them. They found an SS guard hiding in a watchtower. They dragged him down. There were no firearms, only shovels, sticks, and bare hands. American soldiers stood nearby and did not intervene. One officer asked whether they should stop it. A sergeant answered no. The guard was beaten to death. Elsewhere, prisoners captured a German capo, an inmate who had enforced SS discipline inside the camp. They drowned him in a latrine. For a brief period, Dachau ceased to function under any law. The victims became judge and executioner, and the U.S. Army chose not to interfere. Eventually, order returned. Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks halted the violence and confined the remaining German guards, partly to reassert control, partly to protect them from further reprisals. But the events could not be concealed. Photographs existed. Images of executed SS guards. Images of the coal yard. Days later, an official investigation began under Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Whitaker. Soldiers were interviewed. Evidence was collected. The report concluded that American troops had violated international law and recommended courts-martial. The report moved up the chain of command until it reached George S. Patton. Patton read it. He studied the photographs, first the dead SS guards, then the death train. Patton was known as a strict disciplinarian, a commander who punished minor infractions without hesitation. This case, however, he rejected outright. He dismissed the SS as the lowest form of humanity and reportedly called the report garbage. According to accounts, Patton argued that soldiers exposed to such conditions could not be judged by peacetime standards. He refused to approve any courts-martial. The investigation was suppressed, either destroyed or buried in classified archives. The decision was supported by Dwight D. Eisenhower, who had also seen the evidence. Prosecuting American troops for killing SS guards at Dachau was judged to be both unjust and catastrophic for morale. The charges were dropped. Lieutenant Jack Bushyhead returned home to Oklahoma. He never spoke publicly about Dachau and died decades later without giving an account. The Dachau reprisals remain controversial. Extremist groups attempt to exploit them as false equivalents. Historians do not. What occurred was not policy, not premeditation, and not genocide. It was a human breaking point, experienced by men who walked into a place designed to erase humanity itself. Today, Dachau stands as a memorial to the tens of thousands who suffered and died there. There is no monument to the SS guards killed on April 29, 1945. They were buried without markers and without remembrance. History made its judgment. The American soldiers carried the images of the death train for the rest of their lives. Many tried to forget the shootings. Few expressed regret. One veteran later summarized the contradiction simply: he knew killing prisoners was wrong, but in that moment, in that place, it felt inevitable. That is one of the hardest questions war leaves behind. If you had seen the train, would you have pulled the trigger? If you want to examine more moments where history crossed uncomfortable lines, consider subscribing and share your perspective below. These stories only matter if we confront them honestly.